All right. Hey, everybody. I am back, and I just wanted to jump in here and do another quick live for all of the people that are newer on their pet photography journey. Again, I am so glad that you're here with us. I wanted to do today's on what makes a technically correct image, because here's the thing. As we start to develop a style and do different things, like you can start to break some rules, but it's really important to know the rules of photography before you can break them. So I wanted today to talk about what goes into making a technically correct photograph. And so I have some images I'm going to share with you, and I figured out how to get this to happen because I updated my computer to Catalina recently. When I had tested all this before, I had permissions, but since I updated to the new operating system, the permissions didn't transfer over, so I had to re-give permission for that. All right, hold on, let me close that just popped up. Save, hold on a second. Okay. Sorry, it's thinking, it's closing. There we go. All right, let me share with you my screen. Boom. And this is now working. Yay. Okay, awesome. So I want to go over some things that make a technically correct photograph and show you a couple options in here. Basically, the things we're looking for to make a technically correct photograph are exposure. What's the exposure of the image correct? Are you clipping whites? Are you clipping blacks? Can you see detail where you want to see detail? White balance of the image. Is it too warm? Is it too cool? How's the tint? Make sure the colors look like the colors they need to look like. And then focus and aperture, like depth of field. So we're going to talk about focus. So those are mainly the three things, which we're going to talk more in depth about those. But these are the three pieces that I feel that you need to have to be making technically correct work. And also, spoiler alert, technically correct work also equals sellable work. So a lot of pet photographers I work with think, oh, I want to start a business, but they think their work needs to be as incredible as someone who has been in this business for 10 or 15 years before they can start to sell their work, and that's not the case. Their work should be technically correct. If it is technically correct, technically sound, then it is sellable, and then of course, we always continue on the journey of growing our craft, of learning more, of expanding our style, which is why a lot of people are here this week. All right, so let's talk about this exposure thing. So this particular image, I chose these because I have an underexposed and overexposed from the same session. This particular image was shot with a wide angle lens. As you can see, it is correctly exposed. I can look up here, I'll put to develop so we can see what the white, so you can see right over here on my histogram, my develop panel, when I put this little magnifying glass over different parts of the images, the values right down here underneath this histogram change. So it's 90, 90, low 90s, high 90s. If they get to 100%, that means there's no data there. There's no pixels. It's all blown out. You don't have any detail. So we want to avoid that. Generally, I try to avoid this high 90s. I maybe want to keep it in the low 90s, but that's just such a small spot right there that's okay. But if this whole background was high 90s, it might feel a little bit close to being blown out. But we know we have detail there. Likewise, there's not a lot of dark in this image. The nose is probably the darkest thing. It would be blown out if it gets down to like 0. So even right here inside her nostril, look, there's still 1 and 2%. So there's still some data there. Let me show you these two images. Same place, same time, same dog, different lens. Actually, this is the same lens, it's just further back. Oh no, wait, that's 85. What's this one? 24. Never mind, it's different lens. This is my 24, this was my 70 to 200. But you can see here that the dog is underexposed, right? There's no detail on the dog's face. There's not really detail on the dog's front. The light's coming from overhead, the brightest part of the dog to the side. But we did not lose any of our detail in the back. So shooting like this preserves your background, but you don't have detail on the dog. So that is kind of a trade-off there. Whereas here, I have more detail on the dog. It's still not the ideal lighting situation just because it was coming all the way over from the left, kind of backlit, side lit. But you can see, then I look back here and this is just really It's not totally blown out yet, but it's getting pretty close. Like here is almost 100%. Still 98, 99, but it's just so bright. It competes with the dog. So this is not ideal either. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are creating your images, is what is the exposure of the scene. Where the exposure, I'm sure you can agree with me whether this is blown out or not, the exposure of this scene in this scene is not nearly as pleasing as the exposure in this scene, correct? So we want to make sure that the scene as a whole has nice exposure. Now, as we're photographing, especially black and white dogs, it's important to keep an eye on our exposure of these dogs. So we can see right here, the sun was coming from over here. It's kind of backlit, again, coming from the back side-ish. So it's bright right here. You can look 99, 99.1, 99, not blown out, but pretty darn close. 98, 99. And you can tell just because it looks so much brighter. Now, we can adjust this a little bit. So when you're photographing, there's two different types of files you can be creating when you're photographing. You could be creating raw photos, which basically is just, well, let me back up. You can create JPEGs, which is what most people recognize, which is what most of us are creating when we're taking photos on our phone, when we get a new camera, and we're just like, start photographing. That's what it comes out of the box creating is JPEGs. What a JPEG does is a compressed file. So your camera says, boom, you take a picture of this scene, and then the camera says, okay, I've got all these pixels. I'm going to get rid of like a third of these pixels to compress it, and then I can kind of like build it back up. So it throws out some of the data. But when you shoot raw, it takes all of those pixels. It keeps them all, so it's not compressing anything, it's not throwing anything out. So as a result of that, it's much more manageable. So an image like this, I can pull the highlights down a little bit, and look, it pulls those down. So when it was before, these are 99, 98, I can just pull the highlights down a little bit, and then it pulls it down a little bit more. So the challenge though, look, it doesn't pull it down that much. Like this side pulled down a lot more, this side not a ton, because it's once it gets to blown out or almost blown out, there's nothing left to pull back down from. So like even if I pull it all the way down, it's still pretty bright here. It's still mid-90s. So you want to be really sure that you're not clipping those highlights. The most cameras will allow you to turn on a little like blinky warning. Highlight warning is what it's called. I call it the blinkies. I'm not always the most technically photographer or whatever, blinkies, but highlight warnings. So when you take a picture and you look in the back of your camera, it'll be blinking the areas that are blown out. So that's one way to keep an eye on what you're photographing, what you're capturing in camera, so you can make adjustments to your settings as you're capturing. All right, I don't want to get too far into this though, because this isn't going to be an editing. We're talking about fundamentals of what goes into a capture. We will do some basic editing stuff later on. Is it better to be underexposed or overexposed? Well, that depends. That is the million-dollar question. The best is to be properly exposed on your subject and know if there's an area of overexposure or underexposure, that it's okay. For instance, in this image, this sky is pretty much blown out. 99.8, like there's no data there. I can like pull things back down. That's even with the highlights pulling down. So look, 100, that sky's blown out. There's no data there. Dogs has good exposure, but this just makes it uninteresting. Your eye often looks for the brightest spot in a photograph. I've heard brightest, I've heard place of biggest contrast, but definitely bright. Our eye will be drawn to bright areas of an image. So when you have a whole sky blown out like this, your eye competes against the dog. Whereas, here's this dog doing the same kind of thing, but I put a building behind him instead of the sky. And then you know where the focus is. You know where to look. I saw about bracketing. So bracketing for landscapes works really well. Bracketing for live animals, not so much, because they're moving. Even if they're staying, they're still breathing, they're moving. It's a little bit more challenging to do. So instead, What I do is, for instance, if I'm photographing a dog like this, like a dark dog with a lighter background, I will set my exposure so that my dog is bright and the background, but the background's not blown out. So I want my blacks, to pull my blacks up in my image to be as bright as I want them to be, ideally. I can still pull them up a little bit in post, but I'm going to show you in a minute. You don't want to pull it up too much. But I also always want to preserve my highlights. So it's about looking at both where your highlights are and where your darks are and asking yourself, what in this image is most important? What do I need to preserve? What can I do in post if you're doing anything in Lightroom and Photoshop? Why you don't want to always pull things up, like this was I just took a quick picture to see where my settings were at before I started my session. So it's just like, shoot, okay, we're way underexposed. So then I adjust my sessions to get to the proper exposure. But I wanted to show you doing this. I mean, in RAW, you can pull things up, but there's going to be, it's not even in focus, there is going to be a lot of noise, so much noise. Like if you go in here, do you see just all that noise in there? It's so yucky. Super, super yucky. Oh, also guys, should I start with Lightroom or Photoshop? They actually both come together as a photographer's package. It's $10 a month from Adobe, and you get the constant updates. It's fantastic. Back when they used to sell their programs, I would spend more than that upgrading every year anyway. So yeah, so you can do that, Lightroom and Photoshop. If you're doing this and you don't have an interest in editing on Lightroom and Photoshop, there's a free app on your phone called Snapseed that, you know, does these basic adjustments that you can use as well. They work in the same way. Lightroom and Photoshop, though, is generally the gold standard for people that are doing this professionally, though. All right, so anyway, I wanted to show you this of why you don't want to pull things up too far that are underexposed, because the noise gets really yucky. And yes, you can denoise a little bit, but just why do you want to go through all that extra work? Let's just get a properly exposed photograph like this one. All right, one of the other things to look at when you're looking at your exposures is look at the scene. So we have this dog here. It's a light dog on light steps, but then this background's really, really dark. So if you look at this image versus this image, which one's more pleasing to look at? I would say 100% this one, because you know exactly what to focus on. Your eye goes straight to this adorable little face. Because the background is all kind of monochromatic. It's the same tone. It's the same key. Whereas here, you have this dog, and this half of the image is high key, and this half of the image is low key, and your eye's like, holy cow, what do I look at? So keep an eye on your background when you're creating your images so that you know where your eye is going to go, what to focus on. And I threw this one in here because here's a dark dog on a high key background. I'm not saying that you have to be high key dog. High key is light, dark, low key is dark. Like a light dog on a light background or a dark dog on a dark background, you can't mix. You can, but you can see here this whole background is light. So you can see, oh, this is definitely where I want to focus my eyes on this black dog. Where here, you're just like, I just don't know where to look. So just something else to keep in mind when you're capturing those images for your images. Same thing here. Here's another dog, black dog, white background. That's the wide angle lens, but you know exactly where to look. Your eye goes straight to that dog. All right, let's see. Let's move on to white balance. Did they raise the price of Lightroom and Photoshop together? I thought it was still $10. Maybe they just haven't changed mine. I'll have to look. I'll have to look and double check. I thought it was still $10 for the photography plan, but maybe they did raise that. All right. So that is exposure. Do you guys feel like you have a little bit of a better handle on proper exposure and kind of what to look for when you're setting up your images? Which a lot of these, again, are things that we can do in camera so you don't spend time post-processing. You can spend less time on the computer. Let's move on to white balance. Okay. So this is my dog Zoe. Back when we lived in Pittsburgh and there was snow. And you initially look at this, you're like, oh, yeah, no, that looks about right. And then you fix the white balance and you're like, oh, right, okay, no, that really wasn't right at all. So a lot of times automatic white balance, you can play with it, you can use it. If you really want to take your images to a next level, you might want a custom white balance or edit your white balance in post. You can see this one, since the snow is supposed to be white, you can use this little dropper tool and be like, hey, I want this to be white, and it warms it up. I don't love doing that because this one now feels way too warm to me, where this one feels correct. So this doesn't always work. It's not a foolproof. Sometimes the tint, which is the green red, gets a little messed up. So I love to use a gray card. I love to use an Expo disc. I don't have it with me here. I'd have to dig it out of my camera bag. But I have on my YouTube channel talking about white balance there, where I talk about my Expo disc and how to use it. But what it does is it essentially sets up a custom white balance for any profile, any place that you're at, and the images from your camera come out just beautifully white balanced. So here's another thing about white balance. Oh yeah, snow does go to gray sometimes, but you can pull up the whites. Like here, I pulled up the whites quite a bit in this image. Editing snow photos is kind of tough. I have actually this particular image, how I edited it, is on my YouTube channel. If you search YouTube Hair of the Dog Academy, you should see it on there if you want to see how I worked through this particular exact image. Here's another one where the white balance is not quite as obvious. You can see that it's a little green, a little blue, and then I used my Expo disc, and then it comes out of the camera like this. This ended up being the final image there. So that white balance is something that definitely takes your images from like more snapshotty to more professionally done because the colors are looking appropriate. Now, a word about white balance. You need to train your eye to see it. And that takes time because it's just a muscle memory. It's like something that we just have to practice. As with all of these things, when you're growing your craft, it's just things you need to practice. So what you can do when you're starting to edit your photos with white balance, turn your computer off, go away, come back the next day, and you're gonna be like, whoa, what was I thinking? And just practice, throw this up to where it's warmer, throw it up to where it's cooler. That's obviously a bit much. But you can just move it a little tiny bit and just start to see, okay, do I see that warmth? Okay, do I see that blue? Okay, let's put that back. Do I see the greens? Do I see the magentas? Where you can start to see the different colors and things. Be forewarned though, once your eye is into this, you start to get really annoyed when you go into your kitchen. You're like, why are those lights so warm and those lights are so cool? I can't handle this mixed lighting in here. It makes me crazy. Or you have LEDs in your closets of your new home. Basically all like the interior lights of this house. They have like a magenta cast. I'm like, why is my closet pink? Nobody else sees it. It's just me. So be aware if you're going to work on your white balance, those are the problems that might await you. But anyway, so that's white balance. Expo disc or a gray card are great, easy ways to get consistent, beautiful white balance all the time, which I highly recommend. All right, number 3, focus. You look at this quickly, you're like, oh, okay, it's in focus. But yeah, no, not really. You start to looking at this face. It's very, very soft. And where's the focus actually on this? On his butt. His focus is on his butt. So that's definitely something, and no matter how wonderful the image is, if it is not in focus, it's not a keeper for me. There are some where it's like slightly off, that you can maybe sharpen it a little tiny bit. But in the cases where it grabs focus on some other part of the dog, it's really hard to fix because no matter what you do, this face will never be as sharp as his butt. And your eye's always going to go and be like, why is his butt sharper than what I should be looking at? And it just feels wrong. So you want to make sure your images are in focus. And we have actually later on this week, Charlotte Reeves, who's an incredible pet photographer, and she is one of the coaches in the Hair of the Dog Academy, will be doing a Facebook Live to talk all about manual settings. And settings and focus and that kind of stuff. So stay tuned for that. I think she's going to do that on Thursday afternoon, her Friday morning. All right, here's another one where you're like, oh wait, it's in focus. And then you pull in closer and you're like, no, the focus was grabbed back here on the dog's thigh, not the dog's face. So just something to always keep in mind when you look at your images. Sometimes it looks in focus when it's really small on the screen, but then you look at it a little bit closer and you're like, oh, it's not. So something to keep in mind. Also, don't beat yourself up if you have out of focus images. I got that one, and then later on in the session, I got this one. You know, sometimes they're in focus, sometimes they're not. None of us get 100% of our shots in focus, especially action shots. But even still shots, sometimes the focus on our camera just misses. Sometimes we have user error. Sometimes our gear maybe is a little soft. Like there's a whole bunch of different things that can happen. So just because you have an out of focus or soft image every now and again does not mean you're a terrible photographer. It just means you're a photographer. So don't worry about that. All right, one other thing I wanted to talk about on our little fundamentals of what makes a good image, a technically correct image, is aperture. Now, this isn't technically correct or incorrect. It's just a look that a lot of people want, and it is really something that separates a snapshot type image from a more professional looking image, and that is your depth of field. So in this particular image, it's a shallow depth of field. These were trees behind this dog. It was really shallow on the dog. The dog's in focus. The trees are all blown out of focus. This was shot with my 200 millimeter lens, 2.8 aperture. And it just creates that really beautiful separation. Now, there's a couple different ways to get that separation. Number one, you're going to have to be using well, you'll have to use a camera that allows you to adjust your aperture. A lot of phone cameras and things like that, you really can't adjust that much. So this is for people using, like, you know, a true DSLR or a mirrorless camera with different lenses. So your aperture is the F dash whatever number. The smaller the number, the larger the opening, the shallower the depth of field, the more soft the background. So that's one way to change it, is by grabbing a 2.8 or a 2.0 or a 1.4 or a 1.2 lens, and by golly, you're going to have some soft backgrounds. But there's some other ways that you can kind of fake it too, or enhance it, or add to it. Maybe you're working with a regular camera and a kit lens, like the just goes to like 5.6, something like that. The things you can do are a longer focal length. So this 200 millimeter lens, a 2.8, is going to have a much more shallow depth of field than a 24 millimeter lens at 2.8. So grab that longer lens if you want a shallower depth of field, more blurry background. The other thing that you can adjust is the distance from the distance of your subject. So the distance between your subject and the background, the bigger the separation there, the more shallow your depth of field, the softer the background. For that. So a nice big difference. So if you're photographing a dog 3 feet in front of a wall versus, 300 feet in front of a wall, you're going to get a lot more softness with the same lens, the same settings, everything at 300 feet between them. Same thing with the amount of distance between your lens and your subject. The closer you are, the more shallow your depth of field. The further away, the wider it is. So I usually don't adjust that often, because I set my distance to the subject based on the composition I want and how big I want my subject to be in the frame. So I just wanted to share, because that's another thing. The easier thing to look for is the distance from your subject to your background, because that way, you're just setting up for success, and you're composing, that's the word I'm looking for, composing your image in camera as much as you want, because you don't want to come in and crop a whole bunch later, because you're losing a lot of pixels and you won't be able to do as much with that image. Here's just another image where it's showing that shallow depth of field. The dog's eyes are in focus. Nose is not, but that's okay. Owner's a little bit soft back here. So owners love these types of images where they're in the image, but they're not like, it's not a traditional like, cheese picture. So anyway, just wanted to go over some of those things for you. Hopefully you guys found that helpful. So the 3 things you want to look at your images for are, is my exposure correct? Is my white balance correct? is my image in focus. So homework for you. You can choose to do the Pinterest homework. You can choose to do both of these homeworks. Whatever you feel called is the most important thing for you to be focusing on right now is what I want you to do. Your homework for this is to take an image that is technically correct, post it in the group with the hashtag unleash homework, and share it with us. So it needs to be properly exposed. So that means no blown out highlights and no locked up blacks. And it has to have proper white balance, so the colors need to look correct. And then it also needs to be in focus. And remember, these rules are not things that you have to live with forever and ever. When Charlotte speaks, she does a lot of natural light, a lot of backlit, so there's often parts of her images that are blown out. Doesn't mean it's wrong, it's just part of her style and the work that she creates, and it's beautiful. But you need to know what the rules are first, and then you can choose to break them in certain situations. So that's why I wanted to go over this with you guys. Hope you found it helpful. And we'll be back for part 2 of Pet Photography Fundamentals tomorrow. We are going to do tomorrow, hold on, let me look and see, I wrote it down. Oh, composition. We're going to talk about some compositions tomorrow. All right, awesome. Get on your homework. Can't wait to see what you guys post in the group. Thanks for being with me for this extra bonus training. And I'll talk to you guys all soon. Bye, everybody. Oh, Kim, for the homework, it can be straight out of camera if you want. Yep. Or you can edit it. It doesn't matter. It just needs to be technically correct. I don't care how you get there. All right. Thanks, guys. See you later.